for me, it's always, location is the prime thing. If you're going to build a luxury Class A property, which all of them so far have been mid-rise buildings, structured parking garages. So folks that, want the security and access and safety and will pay for a parking space and a private garage, have a fitness center and a resort style pool. And, you've got to have the demand drivers around it that those people are going to want to be there. So, I honestly was not overly familiar with Maryland Heights. I mean, knew Maryland Heights, but hadn't spent a ton of time there. And that project came about. But, you spend some time driving around and getting to know, you have Worldwide Technology, you have Kemper, you have Jones. And I mean, some of these are massive employment bases, and there hasn't really been any new development around it for, 25, sometimes 30, 40 years. And, you can recognize kind of that hole there and that need.
If you or someone you know owns an apartment community, listen up. Storyboard Living is actively seeking 40 to 250 unit apartment communities within a 3-hour drive of St. Louis, whether that's Carbondale, Illinois, Columbia, Missouri, or St. Louis County. We're easy to work with and competitive on pricing. You can send information to deals@storyboardliving.com. That's deals@storyboardliving.com. Michael, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate it. You're a very successful young multifamily developer. And I only say young because, generally speaking, the multifamily developers in St. Louis are folks that might have 10, 20 years on you. But for the amount of success you've had at your age, it's very impressive. You've developed over 1,200 units since 2018. And these are Class A beautiful multifamily units that you've built around the St. Louis MSA. Over $340 million worth of apartments is what you've built, including 100,000 square feet of commercial space, which includes the first Target that was built within St. Louis city limits in the last 20 years. So you're doing truly unique things. I think this will be a great conversation and very insightful for anyone listening and watching.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
And before we dig into some of the projects and how you think about multifamily real estate, would love to chat about how you grew up and where you grew up, how you grew up, and then your first taste of entrepreneurship or real estate.
Yeah. So grew up in St. Louis since, it always comes up. Went to Clayton School District all the way through. And really, kind of always grew up with a facet of real estate around me. My mom has been involved in the industry in various capacities. Her second husband was a multifamily developer. And so I kind of got to go around the country if we had a family trip and, stop by an apartment community and see how it was running, kind of listen to the lingo, good, bad. And kind of look at it from or see someone else looking at it through an owner's eyes. And my dad's attorney, had a lot of business litigation, which, tends to always involve, finance, banking, real estate related cases. So I feel like I kind of grew up with different angles of real estate in different ways. And it was always something I was passionate about getting into.
Got it. That sounds like the perfect background for a multifamily developer because of the various challenges that you have to overcome when you're putting a project together. Did you go to school for anything real estate or finance related?
I went to Vanderbilt down in Nashville, so close to home, and it's a liberal arts school, so there's really no undergraduate business program. So majored in economics with a minor in what we called managerial studies, which was as close to a business type of minor that we offered with classes that were as business as you could get there. But nothing in real estate directly. After college, there was a company called Archon Group that was actually recruiting on campus at Vanderbilt, even though they were based in Dallas. And they were actually a real estate subsidiary of an investment bank of Goldman Sachs. And, that really piqued my interest as I was looking at different companies because, again, grew up around real estate, always knew it was something I wanted to get into. But at the same time, it's, tough to get the right compensation for, a real estate job fresh out of college. A lot of them are, heavy commission-based broker type of positions. And so I started looking at banking. And then as this real estate banking combination came into play, it really ended up being a nice fit for me to go and kind of take not book experience, but experience from kind of growing up and being around it, and then apply it with more financial tools there in Dallas to start my career.
So from there to where you are now is obviously a huge jump. Can you just kind of go over some of the key maybe catalysts or some of the key parts of the journey that led you to starting your own shop in around 2018, if I'm
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah. I think I worked at several different places along the way, from graduating college and again starting in Dallas and then eventually moving back to St. Louis, and probably was of the mindset that after I was at each company for a couple of years, hey, I could go start my own business now, in the real estate industry. And I think all of those points until the last point, it probably would have been a mistake, or it would have been a mistake. I think, you really have to go down the right path and soak up enough knowledge in a lot of different areas to be dangerous, depending on what you're doing in the industry. So really the first chapter of my career was heavy into real estate finance. The position was sourcing debt and then managing that for large acquisitions that the company was making. So started right before the downturn. Had no idea what I was doing, but was on a team, bringing in large loans for big portfolio transactions. And then the downturn happened. And again, our team was managing that debt. So we became the debt workout team, which was challenging. We had transactions that Lehman Brothers was a partner, a lot of syndications of a lot of different large banks that were going through trouble. So as a young person, it was great experience. Some of it, was like a foreign language probably starting, but then you kind of learn that language, learn the Excel modeling, heavy underwriting, and really get comfortable with those types of numbers and how to look at those situations. So that was a challenge, but also a great learning experience. Ultimately wanted to get away from, the big bank red tape side of things and move back to St. Louis. So worked for two different owner operators of multifamily here. Really had started to focus on the product type, which, was a different learning experience because, at a smaller company that's a little more entrepreneurial, wear a lot of different hats. So, there was a lot of exposure to property management, got my property and casualty insurance license. So, we could go kind of broker our own insurance directly. So different parts of the industry that I just hadn't seen at that micro of a level before. But a challenge there was, the market had come back from the downturn and multifamily was a product type. So, we were seeing cap rates as low as they'd ever been and prices as competitive as they'd been. And as an acquisition person in that role there, it was, tough to transact. And, fortunately, you're a salaried employee, you're still trying to get compensation for getting more projects, but it was tough to underwrite and justify deals at that price level. Little did we know going back, we should have bought all of those deals because pricing continued to go up. And I'm probably starting to ramble now, but those were challenges at those firms. And then really my last before starting Pier Property Group was at a tax credit investment firm called Twain Financial in downtown St. Louis, which again was more financially driven, side of the business than a property management, boots on the ground operator. But it was a little bit of a foreign language there as well because it was a tax credit industry, which I'd never really done any, incentivized projects like that before. So had to learn the accounting and legal structuring behind those types of projects, which took, 6 months or a year to really get my feet under me there. But then that kind of gave me the tool to say, hey, I could utilize this incentive on the historic side and, maybe finally start my own business, financial tools, property management tools, even including insurance side of things. And now, there's this financial incentive that I think if done the right way, I could get back into, this thought of owning my own company and get into real estate development.
We were talking about this before we started to record. There was a recent interview where Bob Clark, very well-known real estate entrepreneur, business person in St. Louis, shouted you out twice in an interview. And he said you were a scrappy young developer. You going over your background kind of gave me insight into how scrappy you are because you took so many different roles. And I would imagine every step of the way you had that moment that you kind of mentioned with your first role where it's like, I don't know what I'm doing, but then you figure it out.
Sure.
I have those moments all the time, and it's a part of, the journey, the process of getting better and growing your whatever your entrepreneurial endeavor is. When you were going to jump out and start Pier Property Group in 2018, step out on your own, did you have that same feeling? And then also, did you have maybe a project or thesis or idea in mind before, going out on your own?
Yeah. I think, well, I'll answer the second question first. Really, at my last position, as I started to really, decide I really want to pursue real estate development, I'd love to start with historic tax credit projects just because of that financial incentive and its, an ability to be able to leave a position and, not have to go raise as much outside capital or give as much of a project away. So I had tried to put together a pipeline of projects around St. Louis, existing buildings that would meet the historic requirements that, were in the right area, and then really started to call owners directly. And, if stuff was on the market, call brokers directly, but really try to see what was available really prior to leaving the company and starting Pier Property Group. But, so many risks come up after that. And I think, you work at different companies and you think you know what stress is, and then you start your own business and you realize, there's a whole other gear there that I didn't realize. I thought I knew what hard work was. I thought I knew what stress was. And then there's a whole other level to it that kicks in. And I think, as you said with the start of that question, it's kind of how you manage that stress, and everybody does that differently, but how you navigate through that kind of one step at a time. And I think a lot of it is also bringing in the right relationships locally with the right experience to pair with the right project.
It's interesting that you mentioned you wanted to do tax credit deals, because now, unless I'm mistaken, most of your deals are not tax credit deals. Can you kind of paint a picture on what the atmosphere looked like around 2018 in terms of the availability of credits, maybe, the availability of actual projects versus today?
Yeah. It politically, and really I started the business in 2016, really first project started in 2017, which was historic. And, at that point, the historic tax credit program at a state level was really under a lot of scrutiny. There was, no cap on the program previously annually. So, it started to become a bigger line item on state budgets at different points. And people had kind of thought it had run its course. It was huge in the late 90s when it started, as we've seen here locally on Washington Avenue downtown. And then, it kind of had started to grow larger than I think the state wanted. So there was a lot of pressure to change the program, to implement a different scoring system for projects. A lot of that was based on, job growth and other factors that weren't a part of, the prior program, which was really modeled after just, preserving historic buildings. And so, initially the interest was, twofold. One, it's from a passion perspective, it's great. You walk around an underutilized wood or concrete structure that's been there for, 60, 70, 80, 100 years, was in heavy use for most of its life, and then unfortunately has sat vacant for a period of time. And so to bring those buildings back to life and, to put the blood and sweat and capital into them, to get them across the finish line and see people living in those spaces, enjoying those spaces, making memories again in those spaces is really rewarding from a passion perspective, and the sticks and bricks and the real estate behind it, but also the financial side of it, being able to do a project and get, a state 25% credit and a 20% credit on some of the capital that you're spending, to help offset some of that risk. And again, to not have to raise as much outside capital to go take that risk was very attractive to me. But to answer your question, after going through that, you realize you spend $40 million on a 100-year-old building and it's still 100 years old. So there's, very unique maintenance issues that can come up post-construction that can take a long time to solve. And there's a lot of different components to those historic projects. You might have, instead of a typical deal where you've got, a lender and a partner in the deal on the equity side, here you might have a lender and a partner, but you're also going to have a federal historic investor, a state historic investor, a bridge lender, a lot of compliance to deal with. So those things were kind of starting to weigh on me after completing 3 historic deals. But at the same time, the state actually did go through and change their program. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, it became heavily based on employment numbers. Apartment projects aren't, hotels. We're not office buildings. So, we might have a couple of people at the right size building, in terms of a leasing staff or maintenance staff. But outside of that, some of the scoring didn't really qualify as well for residential projects. So I think both of those things initially kind of shifted me slightly away from the historic world. And then at the same time, following opportunities, right around then, I was approached with a project in St. Louis County in Maryland Heights, and really started exploring the ground up, new construction model. And as you said, since those first three projects, everything has been ground up. Still have looked at several historic deals. I think, once you kind of underwrite them, understand the structure and the players involved, and again, that passion side of it, of bringing a building back to life, it's hard to just ignore that. So I think there will be more historic projects for Pier Property Group, but it's definitely the focus has been more, we can do a larger quantity and maybe not have as large of ownership in each deal, but, do a larger quantity, have, less of those kind of ongoing maintenance issues and touch a wider market as well, because we're not just restricted to urban areas where, all the buildings have to be a certain age.
That makes a lot of sense. And
A lot of
everything,
rambling. I don't know if I
no,
answered you.
you did. And everything you said about the historical or historic buildings has been my experience as well. So we're primarily suburban, 80s or newer vintage. We have one asset that's in the city, and it's probably 70, 80 years old. So not even as old as some of the stuff on Wash Ave, for example. But every time I tour a historic building that's available, that's going to trade, I'm always amazed at the construction quality, the fact that it's irreplaceable, the basis you can potentially buy some of this stuff at. But then I am absolutely scared of how we're going to operate it effectively. There's so many, and in some of them, there's so many common spaces. There's huge components in terms of the mechanicals you need to maintain. There's a lot going on. So you found out pretty early, or you thought pretty early you couldn't scale if you went down that path. Is that fair to say?
I think you could scale, but I think it's a larger challenge. I think it takes a lot longer. I think it's, potentially smaller projects that can add up over time, but all of those smaller projects still have, basically the same challenges the bigger ones do. I mean, you can joke, but it's kind of like you add 10 on the end to do a larger transaction, but you're probably going to face a lot of the same challenges, especially when you're dealing with an 80 or 100-year-old, 3-story and higher building. A lot of them were the same materials. They're built extremely well. The shell is in a great condition, and it's, if we tuck point it and put new windows in and put a new roof on, everything should be great. But, maybe there's concrete spandrels in between where the brick is, and, that needed to get some kind of sealer on it, and it had hairline cracks and water gets in. I mean, there's just all kinds of issues that when you're, retrofitting something of that age, I think, you can start, it becomes a challenge from a cash flow perspective, I think, to be able to scale that as quickly as you can, with the right model and the right decisions on a ground up type of, build it yourself.
You're going into detail on the construction a little bit, and you're a real estate developer with a lean team. So you're outsourcing the management and the construction, correct?
Yeah, so I've really, starting the business, have really tried to build strong relationships with third parties in the market. And, I found, ideally it's a rinse and repeat. And, there are challenges that come up, but, with the right partners and right relationships involved and the right really communication channels, you get over those problems. And then when you face them again, it's even easier to kind of get through more hurdles together. So yeah, I've, developed a really good relationship with Holland Construction right down the street from us here. And, they've done all of my ground up projects, and they really came to the table at our first meeting with a large, lessons learned document, and kind of put it on the table with our architect and said, here are 10 pages of things we've made mistakes on in the past. Let's not do this again. Before we even start the dialogue, let's just kind of, avoid doing these things, which was refreshing to hear, someone admitting, hey, we've made mistakes. We don't want to do it again. And same thing on the architect side, have really primarily worked with 2 different architecture firms since starting this, and really try to team, again, the architect with the contractor. So they've really got this good relationship from an early stage. And again, a big part of that is keeping myself lean, but it's also, this is why these folks have a construction company and architecture firm. I think you see, right or wrong, a lot of different groups try to bring everything in and be completely vertically integrated. And some of that, I think, is to have control from a control perspective, which I get. But just, from a risk and financial, I'd rather let, a professional architecture firm and a professional contractor handle it. And, hopefully that relationship lasts a lifetime. But if it doesn't, you can always cut ties and kind of shift a little bit easier than, having to shut down a division internally. And it's kind of been the same on the property management side for me as well. Initially thought I would have my own property management firm. A lot of that was from a control perspective, but really found that my time was better spent, finding new sites, working on, capital campaigns, and then managing, through the development construction phase of the project. So similarly there, I've been able to rely, local third parties, and having kind of one larger company handle a lot of it still gives me, one touch point. So I'm not calling, 6 different management companies. I can have, a weekly call with one and, really keep a pulse on what's going on.
And I'm sure it helps that everything you've done is in the St. Louis MSA, so you're not worried about different markets and different market conditions in other metro areas.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and part of the beauty of St. Louis is just how tight we are geographically, as we all know. So it's rare to spend more than 15 or 20 minutes in the car and not be able to, get between, all of the assets that I have in that time. So yeah, every week or every other week, I'm able to drive by and touch and go inside and make sure, unless there's something else going on, make sure, that everything is in proper condition, which is easy, and it is easy to control and manage it. Eventually I'd love to, get out of St. Louis as well. I think this will always be home base and kind of our passion city and where we really see ourselves grounded. But I think there's a lot of other markets that are similar to St. Louis that, we would love to expand to as well over time.
I'd love to hear from you how you viewed your deals at a high level before you did them, because you've done deals that on paper no single developer would have done, because some of them are so different. Like you have something going on now in O'Fallon, Illinois, and you've done stuff in the city, and you've done stuff in West County. It's very rare for a developer to be touching all of those submarkets. So can we, maybe starting from the first couple historic deals, can we talk about how you viewed opportunity and what compelled you to do some of the deals you've done?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's a good question, a good point, because they all have been a little bit different. I mean, there's some similarities in groups of them. I think on the first several deals, I was really going out looking for historic buildings. It was really a goal to do historic tax credit projects. So, that kind of zeroes in on city limits for the most part, just for that vintage. And then looking at that, it's really zeroing in on location. So, at the time, I was really focused on the Grove neighborhood and trying to find, and Midtown, but really the Grove seemed to be on fire. Everything was spilling over from the Central West End. It was a great lower cost alternative. We were seeing retail booming, a great, Park Central Development organization that was overseeing the growth of that entire neighborhood. So that really was able to zero in on location, and then again finding a building of the scale that I was looking for. So that first project was a 250,000 square foot warehouse that was, I don't think people realized how large it was and how far back it went. It was on Tower Grove, or it is on Tower Grove Avenue. And then similarly, the second and third projects were Midtown at Grand and Shoto, so very close to the Grove in Midtown, catty corner to where SLU hadn't started yet, but had announced, and SSM had announced their new hospital they were going to start constructing. So again, it was first for those ones finding historic buildings, but then second zeroing in on that prime location. And unfortunately, even back then, the cost to do business in downtown St. Louis was the same as it was in Midtown, or in the Grove, but the rents were just more proven higher and occupancies were more stable. So that really led me to those pockets, I would say. But as things shifted into more ground up new construction, I think it was really just opportunistically following opportunities. For me, it's always, location is the prime thing. If you're going to build a luxury Class A property, which all of them so far have been mid-rise buildings, structured parking garages, so folks that, want the security and access and safety and will pay for a parking space and a private garage, have a fitness center and a resort style pool. And, you've got to have the demand drivers around it that those people are going to want to be there. So, I honestly was not overly familiar with Maryland Heights. I mean, knew Maryland Heights, but hadn't spent a ton of time there. And that project came about. But, you spend some time driving around and getting to know, you have Worldwide Technology, you have Kemper, you have Jones. And I mean, some of these are massive employment bases, and there hasn't really been any new development around it for, 25, sometimes 30, 40 years. And, you can recognize kind of that hole there and that need. And, Chesterfield is similar but different. I think Chesterfield, really checked every box in terms of, affluent, safe, suburban, but you also have corporations like RGA and Pfizer and now Bayer, all out there. So there's kind of all of that perfect storm coming together in that market. And this might have been part of your question, but I think it's also, what product are you delivering to each one of those submarkets? Because they're all a little bit different. The city stuff tends to be, it's historic, but it can be grungy, but clean, but it's young and has a different energy. Chesterfield, we've got, I think more of a mixed bag of demographics interested. We've got empty nesters, you have young professionals. And so some of the materials you use, some of the, decor inside, it all has to kind of deliver on that demand.
Yeah, you bring up a really interesting thought, and I don't want to put you on the spot. So if you don't think you have a good answer here, I think you do, which is why I'm asking. But if you don't, if you think you don't, just let me know. If I were to just like name a few renter profiles, would you be able to give like what type of floor plan finishes you would build for that type of renter? Like if I were to say a SLU student who is living in the city and is looking for a one bedroom, or let's just say it's SLU students, what are you building for that type of profile, or what would you build?
Yeah. And I think, good question. And I think in some instances, comparing that demographic, let's say to like an empty nester in Chesterfield or somewhere, more suburban, I think, some of the finishes can be very similar. Most of these new buildings, we're seeing quartz or some kind of solid surface countertop. You're seeing tile backsplashes in the kitchens, really the same cabinet quality, I think, for both of those demographics.
So you're saying like from the college student through young professionals through the empty nester, you're seeing a similar kitchen cabinet, countertop?
I think for a lot of that stuff, yes. I think there are certain things that other profile focus on more, the empty nester, older profile, like soft closed cabinets and soft closed drawers. I see in a lot of the more student, younger, focused projects, maybe a fiberglass shower surround in, a Chesterfield, where again, the rents can reflect this being a little bit higher as well. But, you might have a tile surround for your shower. You might have a glass shower door instead of a shower. There can be little differences like that. But I think a lot of it is the energy, when you walk down a corridor, what are the colors of the corridor? What are the, what's the artwork in the club? What's the furniture in the clubhouse or in the living space? What's the pool furniture, pool deck have to have, and how big does it need to be? I do think those units that are more for that young professional tend to be a little bit tighter, a little bit smaller. We see this demographic of, again, people not committing and not getting married and not buying a house until a little bit later in life. And then on the flip side, you see these empty nesters that kids are gone. They want to travel more. They don't want to be committed to a house. So, they're getting out and kind of downsizing into an apartment. I still think, the ones that are downsizing need a bigger unit. The ones that are starting probably start smaller. So I think, that sizing is a little bit different too.
What about in terms of like the ceiling height, window sizes, stuff like that? Is that pretty universal?
I think it is. Yeah. Typically I think, the more windows you can have, the better is what you see, unless, it's a complete, walls of windows, an entire, private space. Typically, ceiling height, we try to go as high as possible, but we run into construction constraints. All of our, not to get too construction-y again, but, all of our new construction buildings are, panelized wall systems. So wood that's basically put into a wall off-site. And then when they come on site, they're, kind of put together almost like Legos, for lack of a better. And so those have certain restrictions from a structural and how tall they can be. So typically we see 10-foot ceilings on the ground floor and then 9-foot ceilings above that. The historic projects, obviously larger than that. Some of them can have 12 or 14-foot tall ceilings, which is unique. But yeah, that's pretty standard, I think.
And are you going into a project with all of this already fleshed out before you even like buy a piece of ground, or before you look at a piece of ground, or is it all like, what does your process look like, if you don't mind going step by step?
No, I think that's a great question. I think, for me, I guess it's first, kind of what are we looking for as a company? And really for us, it's, kind of that 150 or 200 unit and larger project, really to be able to deliver that Class A product and amenitize it the right way, justify having, the right amount of elevators and the parking counts and pool and fitness center and spreading those amenities out to the right type of units. So, I think first big step is, could this site fit, a project of the scale we're looking for? But then again, it's really first step, or 1A before that would be, location and, what's going on around here? What are the employment drivers? How long term is this site? Is there stuff happening that can push the needle one way or another that we should be concerned about? And then if those boxes are checked and a conversation, seems like it could head the right direction with the seller, it's really bringing an architect in very early. Again, I really try to rely on others because it's not my expertise. And I'll be the first to admit that. So bring an architect in, them do some kind of very high level, concept design, which might just be, a sketch on a piece of paper that they've done to scale, figure out approximately what our floor plates could be in a building. And then we can kind of look at, in a typical building, are we building apartments on 85% of that? How efficient is our space? And then from there, roughly think of a unit count, a unit mix that we would want to get to in terms of, is this more of a young professional market where we want 1 bedrooms and studios and smaller units? Or is this more suburban where we need something larger? We need to add more 3 bedrooms. So all that to say, kind of come up with a unit mix and figure out what our proper unit count is. And then I think it's a high level underwriting process, on bringing in that construction team, even if it's early, to say, what do you think the cost is to build a mid-rise building with structured parking in a Maryland Heights, and what are the challenges with this site? Is it on a hill? Is it flat? How much grading? Can we work with the grading? And once that's identified and you've got just a very high level cost, I think it's easy to pencil underwriting of expenses and what rent levels you're seeing in that market or where you think it can go, and putting together, your model from there. And I think if all of those boxes check along the way, then there starts to be a more serious conversation with the seller and work with the city on, what their approval process looks like and, how long of a due diligence period do I need to get this under contract for, ideally with the seller. And then again, if those boxes check, kind of taking the next step down through the planning and design and closing. I always have tried to close on the site simultaneous with at the same time as a construction loan and my equity for the project. So there's not, downtime and risk of, something happening. That doesn't always, but that's typically how I've tried to do them.
Have you had any projects where, you almost got there and then you just, for whatever reason, it didn't pencil, market conditions changed, whatever happened, you didn't proceed?
Yeah, I mean, there have been for sure. I mean, I think, and recently the market's been very difficult. I mean, it's been a challenging environment. I had the 10-acre, 11-acre Calera site in Clayton under contract about 1.5 2 years ago for 8-9 months of planning, and really just the site's great location. It was a high basis for the site, but again, the location kind of mitigated that. A lot of demand behind the site, but just capital environment and having to acquire it without being able to get it entitled through the city first, just because of the timeline that the seller was working on was tight, made that one a challenge, and ultimately, had to kind of put our hands up and just walk away from a while, and stayed very engaged and hoped that it might, come back into the mix. And luckily something's happening with that site now, but yeah, had to ultimately walk away from that one. There have been, several others that, get through the first couple of phases of what I mentioned, bring in an architect, put a concept together, spend some money on it. Maybe, you even get as far as doing an environmental test or a geotechnical, a seismic test. And, if it doesn't check a box and there's risks there, I think you have to know, when you can't force it. So that definitely happens.
Sure. Makes a lot of sense. And it's better to walk away before you start building, right?
Yes, exactly. And that's really why, I try to have, those financing pieces all lined up. And when we're closing on the site, we've typically, it requires some capital to be risked up front to get plans done and things like that early. But at least, you're off to the races and you're not going to hopefully find some of that stuff that you found early on because you already know about it.
Generally speaking, are you financing your deals with community banks, or are you getting some other source of financing on the debt side? And then in terms of equity, as much as you want to share or not share, if if a high net worth person wanted to invest with you, could they, or do you already have pre-existing relationships?
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of different on the first few projects because they were historic tax credit deals. So, those are a unique group of lenders, I would say, to really understand how those tax credit deals work. And there's several of them in St. Louis, regional groups that do that. So those, regional banks on those historic deals on the lending side. On the historic tax credit equity side, the groups that the federal and state credits. One of those was a local Missouri, was Commerce Bank here, and another one was more of a, national bank, that buys those federal credits. But on the investor side on those deals, again, it was a smaller equity check, but still required a real and a large loan guarantee. And obviously, just starting the business, I was not of the strength to fulfill that for the bank. So that was ultra high net worth individuals that either one instant had known as a family friend and had talked to for a while about getting involved in a project. In another instance, more relationships getting introduced to folks. But I think starting out in this business, especially asking someone to expose a balance sheet and give capital to a project, the project has to make sense from an underwriting perspective, but a lot of it is kind of believing in who the sponsor is and who's starting the business, because it truly it is a startup in a lot of ways, even though there's the underwriting behind it and the tangible asset behind it. There was that belief, and so then shifting from those historic deals, it's really been more conventional, still the same debt type of sources. I think St. Louis is way overbanked in terms of just amount of lenders and really some really large, great lenders that we have here. So those relationships have been strong. But on the equity side, it's been more institutional, bringing in private equity groups to joint venture with on those projects. They're typically interested in, 10 million and larger type of equity checks. So, the historic deals don't necessarily fit their typical mold, but these ones have. So that's been really the shift recently. But I would say, capital really drives, every business, I think, and really ultimately, drives decisions behind businesses. And so I'm always looking to expand those relationships, even if there's a large relationship with an institution on my side, sometimes, they're already allocated to their development, bucket that they had. So, you have to wait for them to re-up funds. So I don't think you can ever have enough relationships there. So yeah, to answer your question, my number is...
we'll put your personal cell phone in the show notes. How about that?
Yeah, exactly.
No, I appreciate you sharing. That makes a lot of sense. On the Midtown deals, one of them has a Target as the anchor tenant, if you will.
Yep.
The first Target to move into city limits in over 20 years. Was that a part of the plan going in, or did it just happen organically? Can you walk through that story a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely wasn't going in. We really started, I know I mentioned first project was on Tower in the Grove neighborhood, and this is a mile or two east of there. Really started because we liked the neighborhood, found a historic building, that kind of checked those underwriting boxes we mentioned earlier, and saw that, it wasn't just one building. There were a couple of other buildings in the neighborhood that we could get to over time. And so that was the first thought. It wasn't, let's put apartments here and then build a Target. And hopefully, by the way, Top will come next to us at some point. But, it was, hey, there's a lot of opportunity in this neighborhood. We're in a very good location around, in the middle of a 15,000 student university, the new hospital being built. It checks a lot of boxes. We should control some of this land now. We should acquire more of this neighborhood than just this first phase we're doing. So, fortunately had an investor at the time that kind of saw that as well and saw an opportunity to acquire some of that land at a very low basis. So we tried to do that to just control the future of the neighborhood without honestly knowing what use might go there, if it was going to be more apartments or a hotel eventually. And then as that happened, and as we got a couple of our projects completed, across Grand from us was the Iron Hill proposed project on a 14-acre site that SLU owns. And, that was getting interest from the Targets of the world, from, large hotel operators, from some entertainment groups, which started to open us up a little bit more to, hey, we could be a great secondary option if something happens with that project, or if they end up filling up their space, we can kind of respond to that demand here because we've got land already acquired. And basically that kind of started to happen, I think, with Target. I don't think they were ever officially, signed up to go to that site, but I think, there were some challenges they had logistically with how things could be parked and how big their store could be and just how it fit in and had to be a part of a much larger project. So we really cold called and reached out and phoned pretty quickly their real estate folks, and again, already owned this site. And so kind of took that site, had a concept on it for them fairly quickly. And we were able to really adapt that space to them versus I think what they were looking at before was, this was the space. It was part of a much larger plan, and it was what they were left with. So I think being able to massage that for them the way that they wanted was really refreshing, and ultimately, was able to bring them into the neighborhood. SLU had also been laying the tracks for a target for years. I think for probably over a decade, they had made it pretty clear that that's what they really wanted for their students. That's what they wanted in the area. So that was helpful as well. But I think, the reason that we've had some success on our quadrant there, or on our side of the intersection there, has really just been, phased development over time, one piece at a time, versus, I think in St. Louis, it's a challenge in the city to, just put 300 million all at the same time in one, swoop. So, yeah.
So if I understand correctly, what you're getting at there is like you're trying to avoid having one of those development islands that we get in the city where, a group or groups will invest a ton of capital into a part of town and then it's kind of cut off from other parts of town.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's just managing risk, right? I mean, let's take one bite at a time and make sure that people like this and that they want to live. And if they don't, it can change for the next bite, and we can adapt. And, we've got in that neighborhood in particular, we've got about 350 units amongst 4 projects that we've completed now. That might be enough apartments for now in that neighborhood. We probably need more retail. We could have a hotel to support hospitals, the one that's completed and the one that's under construction now across the street. So, I think it can help you be more thoughtful and not make some of those mistakes if there's an ability to phase it in, one step at a time and be a little bit reactive to what that demand is. Because yeah, you're right. If it's all there and built and that sounded great day 1, but all of a sudden, day 50, it's a little bit of a different story. It's tough to tear down a new building and build something new. So yeah.
Sure. Makes a lot of sense. You're also graduating. I don't want to say graduating. You're evolving as a real estate developer. You're now looking to do a mixed use development in O'Fallon, Illinois. Is that a sign of like things to come? Are you going to start focusing more on mixed use developments? And then 2, can you shed some light on that development, how it came about and what the plans are?
Yeah. I mean, to think, multifamily is always going to be our core business. It's really the product type that I, really have the most experience in and really relate the most to and I'm really interested in from a risk perspective. But as we've done more of those projects and looked at more of those projects in these suburban settings, there's really something appealing, with current demographics on, being able to walk to a market or a restaurant or to get your nails done or to get a cup of coffee or a sandwich and have a hotel nearby that family or folks are staying, that's all walkable and all contained. And a lot of those even include a lot of outdoor activities like walking paths and connectivity. So I think, just to sit and only do the apartment piece, forever didn't really make sense when we really could participate in building something bigger that I think is more sustainable, that can feed off of itself. So that was a lot of the interest. Even though our core business will always be on the apartment side, I think there was an interest in doing more and doing something bigger that could monetize itself. But, similar to looking in Maryland Heights and Chesterfield, O'Fallon was somewhat of an opportunistic location for me to get involved in, really just following communication and talking with folks at the city here in the city of O'Fallon and some neighbors and some folks we've been able to partner with on the project. And realizing that demand that's there. The site we're under contract on is directly across from the O'Fallon Family Sports Park. So, they saw over 1.5 million visitors last year, second park in the area to the Arch. So, I mean, it's a real number. There's a real demand there. And, if you're there on the weekends, it's tough. There's a lot of traffic, a lot of people in and out. And, there's no entertainment options nearby. There's no, food options nearby, no large, housing or hotel options that are really, walking, directly from the park. So that coupled with the fact that there was, a large amount of land available in that location, really piqued our interest in, what can we do to kind of ease the traffic going in and out, just, coming in and out and maybe not spending enough time in O'Fallon and contributing to the local economy. But how do we make the experience better just generally for folks that are going there? I have 3 young kids that all do sports, and, sometimes one of them has a game or 2 games, and that's, 4 or 5 hours of your day with waiting time in between. Where can the other parent take the other 2 kids for a couple hours, blow some steam off for them and get some energy out, have a beer or a sandwich, and then, get back over to the game. So, this project in particular will have a pedestrian tunnel that will connect into the sports park to allow folks to do that. It'll have that hotel aspect. So when people are, staying in the area from Louisville or Evanston or, all different types of Midwest markets that they're coming to the sports park, they can just park, stay at the hotel, be able to walk the whole way. And again, bring that revenue or keep that revenue from an economic perspective in O'Fallon. There was an interest in focusing on these larger mixed use projects. I don't think it will be, or it wasn't necessarily our core focus. But then when this location with this demand came up, it really checked a lot of boxes to pique interest.
I think it's a great project. I saw it in Belleville News Democrat, and I was excited. I'm very familiar with the Metro East, with O'Fallon, and I think it's going to do very well. And it is much needed, without a doubt. I would like to ask you a question that you may not appreciate. How do tariffs impact apartment development and the general, economic conditions we're in today, April 2025? We still have kind of a shaky insurance market. Rents, I would say, depending on where you are kind of flat. They're still increasing a little bit. It's just, how are you viewing all of these challenges and hurdles?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step is trying, from a tariff perspective, is trying not to overreact. I think, we hear things and can respond to them really quickly politically when maybe there's, a longer picture there or something we don't understand, or it's part of a larger negotiation that is, going to lead to something else that could ultimately be a positive. And I think, I don't know for sure if that's the case here, but I try not to, really overreact until we really see what the impact is and how it's going to impact things more directly. Because the off the cuff response is, as a real estate developer, most of my projects are all wood frame construction. A lot of that wood comes from up north from Canada. Obviously that would have a direct impact on already, hyperinflated from a couple years ago construction costs. But I think, again, when you take a step back, maybe part of the reason for this tariff negotiation is ultimately to force the Fed to start lowering interest rates a little bit. And, I think that is much needed. Again, as a real estate developer, financially, that impacts projects a lot. But also, I think for several months with how quickly rates went up, there have been a couple metrics that it seems like the Fed has looked at to determine that the economy is just doing great. When I talk to people locally that are businesses, whether that's construction companies, architecture firms, or when I talk to private equity groups that are working on large M&A transactions, the transaction volume has just gone down significantly in the private sectors. And, maybe folks are doing deals, but they're smaller, or it takes, 3 or 4 times as long to get a project completed. And I think a lot of that is because these interest rates have made it really challenging to get business done. And I'm not saying they should be back to where they were previously, but I think some relief there is ultimately what will kind of get the development and the rest of the economy churning again, because I think it is in a really tight spot right now. So I think, again, trying not to overreact to all the tariff convo, but really the hope there is, from an optimistic perspective, it's going to lead to a positive with ideally, a lowering of interest rates faster than what we've all been told.
Got it. So you think, like, one way or another, things will work itself out. And I don't want to oversimplify what you just said, but let me add to that. They have to, because we have a shortage of housing units.
Correct.
So it has to work out one way or another.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, and there is a challenge there, as you said, especially I think in a St. Louis, we saw, rents skyrocket, for a couple of years, and part of that costs were going up. And, folks like me were able to underwrite, and you were able to underwrite, against some of those costs because of that rent. And as you said, it has leveled off. I mean, we're not seeing those types of increases, and we're seeing, flat. We're not really seeing growth at this point. But you're right. I mean, there is a shortage of housing, and especially the shortage of rental housing, considering we've got, again, these demographics on either end that are kind of either staying in apartments longer before they move into a home for either barriers to entry or, not getting married, lifestyle changes, whatever that is. And then you've got the empty nester that, are downsizing more and are living in smaller spaces. And so there's definitely a shortage. There's a lack of supply of single family housing on the market. Which is, an interesting component of it too. And I think a lot of that is related to this high interest rate environment as well, because, you're locked into a sub 3% or even a sub 4%, rate on a nice home. If you want to go move into, even an equal value home now, which if you're trying to move up in value in home, you might end up spending 3 or 4 times, your cost of living to do that now. So I think there's been a lot of log jams here that lower rates will start to clear up. And yeah, I think that need and that demand for housing, even if eventually that means rates, go back up to compensate for that, I think we'll absorb it. But again, my big hope is interest rates going down will help offset that. But I think it's also, they're a negotiating tactic, I think, for that end game is what I'm hoping.
And it would look pretty good if your deal pencils in a high rate environment, and then when you deliver, or rates are even a little lower. I'm sure it'd have a massive impact on the potential exit.
Yeah.
Although you did say that you build for long-term ownership and you selectively sell, just depending on market conditions and the partners in the deal and things like that.
Yeah. That's really my approach. Is pretty much what you said. I think a lot of it is partner driven. Most of these lately, these joint venture partners that are institutional private equity groups, they've got a fund that's investing in the deal. So it's got, a specific investment life and life cycle that deals are supposed to take. So typically that might be 3 to 5 years or 5 to 7 years. So, there's either an opportunity where, I could buy that partner out and bring in a new group, or maybe it makes sense if the market's right to go take it to market. We've really only sold one asset that we've completed, which was last year, that Maryland Heights project that I mentioned. But everything else we still hold, really, try to build things the right way so that you have that option. If this ends up being a 10, 15, 20-year investment, we know it's not going anywhere. We know the right teams worked on it. We oversaw the construction. There's a lot of security there for us. And then also for knowing the residents that are moving into the buildings have, a well-built, secure building to live in.
Got it. I have to ask you before we start to wrap up here about the city. You're a St. Louis guy. You've seen a couple ups and downs in the city in terms of, if we're talking Wash Ave or we're talking the Landing or other parts of the city. What are your thoughts, generally speaking, on the future of the city? What submarkets do you think could do well? And will you be doing projects in the city anytime in the near future?
Yeah, good question. And I mentioned earlier, even when I started looking at historic buildings, doing something downtown city, is very different than doing something in Midtown or Central West End. So I think, like all of St. Louis, it's very pockety, and you kind of have to know, what intersections you're looking at and what's going on around it. I think it's sad, being from St. Louis, being a really proud St. Louisan, being a big sports fan of St. Louis, and then looking at project, I spend a lot of time in the city and a lot of time downtown. And, to drive down there on a daily or multiple times a week basis and, simple things like trash pickup and, on the streets, where we're supposed to be trying to attract new businesses to come in and, potholes that you literally can't drive a block without your car having to swerve back. It's, these are simple things. The city had, capital that was brought in, and it's been, from my perspective, 2 or 3 years of arguing over how to spend it, and none of it really gets spent. And then, you've got this perception that crime has gotten better, which I think people that live here, don't believe any of that at all when you hear our current mayor throw those statistics out. And so, it's sad. And I think those simple things like having a clean environment with roads you can walk on and sidewalks that are safe and lit is the fundamental for why, we don't have security, why folks can come into downtown and fire guns off into the air on 4th of July. And do all kinds of things that you just wouldn't imagine they'd be able to do in a downtown urban environment like that. And it's why people aren't going downtown as much and why companies are leaving. So I think a lot of, the problems, at least in my view, start from just that basic, service and basic curb appeal of a city, which, part of that is real estate, right? We want our properties to look right. We want the pavement to look nice and the landscaping to look nice. So I think, it's proper schooling, it's proper policing, there are a lot of challenges ahead. And I think, unfortunately, and just my opinion, but, this last, mayor's office has probably not done nothing, done, the opposite of, I mean, they've put us in a big hole. So I think as hopefully Kara takes over here, not to have a political, rant here, but hopefully as she takes over, I think she knows there's a lot of things that need to get addressed. And I think it's almost, what do you do first and how quickly can you start to get businesses to come back downtown? Because for me, until there's security and until there's ability to underwrite a certain rent level for an expected demographic that we're looking for to be able to, pay the rents to justify doing the building. Yeah, there's a lot of work that has to get there, I think, before we can do that. And hopefully that happens quickly. But as someone who's from here and passionate about it and loves St. Louis, I'm always looking for opportunities. I've got a site that I own in the Central West End that, we're hoping to be able to start construction on this summer. Again, not downtown, but still in the city. We've got a project near the Grove that, we've been working on for a while that would actually be office space. So downtown, I would love to have a project there that made sense. I think it's just waiting until either that demand is there and that security is there, or, until the city figures out the right way to, incentivize, developers from the private market to come down and take the risk. And I don't know if that's, public-private partnerships that are more, heavy, but, I've told SLDC, and like, I'm all ears to see if I can donate, sweat equity to a project and there's a way for public to finance it and it's just to help the city and get something done. I think there's a lot of groups that, would be interested in helping to help with the city. So, it keeps me focused, keeps me spread, able to look in places like O'Fallon, Illinois, to St. Charles and, Warrenton and places on the far west side and really stay spread because, every pocket of St. Louis has different opportunities and different challenges. Some of them are, what building materials you're allowed to use because there's very high requirements. And then some of them are more, political with, who's the leadership and is this a secure place, for the long term.
Do you think a lot of that keeps some of your national competitors from coming to St. Louis?
I do. I think, St. Louis, it's odd. I think when I talk to equity groups or capital providers, nationally, a lot of them refer to St. Louis as a tertiary market, and sitting here from here, and it's like, we're almost 3 million people in the MSA, we might not be shooting up in population growth, but I mean, we're over double what Nashville. Yeah, I mean, we're a huge market, but they consider a Nashville, a secondary market. So I think for a while we've had a tough time attracting out of town capital to the market, which I think has kept out a lot of the development competition. I think you see it in hotel space, maybe downtown. You see some hotel operators that are out of town groups, but fortunately or unfortunately, there aren't really a lot of folks doing 150, 200 unit and larger development opportunities on the multifamily side in St. Louis. Cause I think you're right. It's a challenge. It's politically a challenge. It's very, again, pockety from a geographic perspective. And so, I think a lot of people fly over and ignore it. And I think there's other markets like us, which that's where, I'd love to expand and get into some of those cities as well, just because I think they've been ignored for so long that it's created this demand and this lack of supply of this luxury housing that's needed.
A real estate developer that I think you probably know, Larry Chapman, he said, until we hit 3% population growth, we won't see those types of groups want to deal with just the hassle of being in St. Louis, the different municipalities, the political red tape, depending on where you are, and all those challenges. Hopefully we get the 3% population growth at some point. You're very passionate about the city, and I am too. I love the region. Do you think we'll get there?
I don't know. Probably not, to be honest with you. And I don't know that that's a problem. I mean, again, I think for a long period of time and at different companies I worked for when I moved back to St. Louis, it was, why would you ever develop in St. Louis? There's no population growth. And I think because that was the sentiment for 30 years or however long for the most part, that's why we are developing here now, because there's been this missed opportunity. And so I think, it's not just population growth that can drive development. I mean, we've got a lot of inventory of B minus C housing. People pay rents in some of those instances that, could justify living in a much nicer, newly built community. So I think, there's something to be said about condition of housing and being able to deliver a product that's not here versus just we need population growth to justify development. Now, obviously, there's a bookend there. You can't just go, be a Dallas or a Denver, and build 13,000 units every year and think they're going to get absorbed. But I think there's enough to be done thoughtfully over time to fill that void. But it might keep the town, developer from coming in because there's just this finite number.
Yeah, that's a great point. There is a percentage of housing stock that becomes obsolete every year as well. And we see
Correct.
that even in like small towns where if we own B product, the demand is going up every year, even if the population growth isn't, because you have like 40s, 30s vintage housing that just is no longer livable.
Yeah. And, the C property might get demolished and maybe some of those residents go into a B property and the Bs end up moving up to an A. And, it kind of creates this vacuum. But ultimately, everybody's quality of housing has gone up, which I think has to happen naturally.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great point. We end each show with what I call the hole in one. So your greatest piece of advice that you can give to someone that they can implement in either their life or business. Could be life advice, could be business advice, real estate development advice, whatever you want to share.
Yeah. I think it's probably, twofold. I think a lot of, especially starting this business, but really continuing through it, is be persistent. I think, there's a fine line of, being a pest kind of versus being persistent, but really find that line and drive it as hard as you can. Because, you're the one trying to create something for yourself, create, your business or your destiny or whatever you're looking for. So I think really having that push and persistence is really key. And along with that, I would say pick up the phone. It's 2025. Everybody's emailing, texting. Nobody wants to talk on the phone. Even I'll catch myself sometimes. Someone calls and I'll kind of think, I'll just text them back later. But I have learned over and over and over again, getting in front of someone in person, getting them on the phone, can be so helpful and so meaningful. So I think persistence and pick up the phone.
Those are two great points. Thank you for sharing and thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Really enjoyed it.
Yeah.